have in the New Testament, inspired of God. See, inspiration, this is where, of course inspiration matters, but this is a unique way in which inspiration matters. If the Bible is inspired, if this is God-breathed, then this is God-breathed also. Not just, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. I hate that we sometimes separate, and the reason I don't like that is that I think I look at things differently. I think I'm prone to look at things differently, a little more seriously, when I believe it's doctrine. Human nature. When I believe it's doctrine. And then those things that we're just encouraged to try to do and be, human nature might not always give quite as much attention as that which we believe to be doctrine. And I just think our demeanor is part of the teaching. Our demeanor is that's teaching. He's teaching me this here, just like he was teaching me something else. And so I think that brings a level of seriousness back to our demeanor that matters, rather than, well, this is just, we're encouraged to think this way. No, this is serious, okay? And so that's how I mean that. Older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. So part of our purity, I said that to say this, part of our purity is our demeanor. I think sometimes we talk about doctrinal purity. I think part of our purity is our demeanor. You look at the fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5, and you're going to see things that have to do with your demeanor, with people, with one another, in the body, but also in general. And so I just wanted to highlight that, and I appreciate the fact that he wraps up verse 2 after saying the things he said, and we talked about why he's saying this. He wraps it up with all purity, to remind me that this is part of, I think, purity. Well, moving into verse 3, getting into a new section here about honoring true widows. Now, we'll talk about what true means. You say honoring true widows. It's like, well, what's a true widow? Well, somebody said, well, a true widow is her husband has passed. Oh, okay. But that's not what he means here. And so we'll get into that as these verses unfold. Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. If any widow has children or grandchildren, now a responsibility, early verse 4, and then mid verse 4, there's a flip. You've heard the phrase, the shoe put on the other foot. Well, I don't know if it's the other foot, but it's one of the feet. Okay, the shoe is put on the feet of the family, even the children and the grandchildren. And he's talking about what they should do, but also why they should do it. There's phrasing there, even in the original language, that's why they should. Show piety, middle of verse 4. Does anybody have a phrase besides show piety in terms of how they are to do it? Or what they seem to be showing? Let me read and show you where I am. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. Now, in that phrasing, what do you have? Godliness. This is showing godliness, by the way. How or why would that be showing godliness? Well, if we talk about to be Christ-like would mean, just flip it, that would mean like Christ, obviously. Godliness, we're bringing that which is of God, from God, like God, and which God encourages us to do. So I'm not saying that. That's not the discussion. But we are obsessed, I think, in our culture with my right, or rights. And Paul is sort of saying, what did Jesus have a right to? Where was He? Who is He? Which would then give Him a right to. Okay? But he wouldn't think that way. Okay, I want your mind to go into that as you go back to the middle of verse 4. It's love that drives It's love that drives a different action regardless of what somebody may have had a right to do that's different. How they might have a right to think that's different. I don't remember the TV show. I don't. The phrase just comes to mind right now, frankly. I didn't have this planned. And it's something where I've seen this particular episode of whatever this show was. I've seen this particular episode numerous times, okay, three or four times. And somebody says, but I have a right to, and it's a parent that replies then. And they say, you have a right to be thankful. Okay. I think that's, boy, I tell you what, now that's hard to beat right there. Y'all looking up here, and I only get so cute, but that was a lot better right there. You have a right to be something else. Well, look at the middle of verse 4. To show piety at home and to repay their parents. And so I hope my sons do this one day. I have every belief that they would want to and will, if for nothing else because they love their mom. But that's the reality. So he's getting into a situation when he talks about widows that are widows indeed, true widows, and he's getting into responsibility. And he places first responsibility not upon the body, not upon the church, but first responsibility squarely somewhere else, picking up in verse 4 to do that. And then he closes out that verse by saying, this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Now, some translations I think will say wanton pleasure, W-A-N-T-O-N. What does that mean? If you ever see the old word wanton pleasure, what is that compared to just pleasure? What if he just says lives in pleasure? So it says wanton pleasure. What comes to your mind? Careless? I like that thought. And I think it's accurate. Any other descriptions? Wanton pleasure? So, as we look at verse 3, now she who is really a widow, left alone. Then he talks about, now listen, here's a qualifier, mid-verse 3. He begins to qualify the life she leads. And he compares it to another life in the very next verse. Second half of verse 5. Second half of verse 5. And then the comparison of something different in verse 6. In other words, by the way, look at verse 7. I should have stayed with it. And these things command that they may be blameless. These things command. So this is pretty serious consideration is my point. When you look at what you have in verse 7, this is a pretty serious consideration for the body. Is this a serious consideration for the elders, for a benevolence committee, or members of the church? It is when you get these things command. Not these things suggest, these things command, teach. This is an overview of the type of widow, not just a widow indeed, but a type of widow also. Don?
Being an elder for 20 years, there's a lot of things that surprise me on the way that we would act. One of the biggest things is this right here is where a lot of people felt it's the church's position to take care of my mother and my father, not mine. And it just really surprised me. It's not that they couldn't do it. It just said the church first, and then I'll do whatever the church can do. And it wouldn't matter if they lived here in Nashville or if they didn't live in Nashville. It was really surprising.
I have seen that in discussions with my elders at congregations where I've been before Creve Hall, and have no doubt that and especially in a congregation as sizable as Creve Hall has been historically, even more so, just because numbers means you're going to have the potential for this more often than a smaller congregation might have. And I was about to say disheartening. It can be disheartening with any time, and especially for elders who are trying to shepherd souls. And again, what we've talked about this as what is the role of elders is first spiritual. So when they're talking to one of these people, maybe one of these children of expecting something from the church, they're having to be careful, but also teach and shepherd spiritually. But they also don't want to, Ephesians 6, I think it's verse 4. For example, fathers, do not exasperate your children unto wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Okay, unto wrath. Elders don't want to get there when what they're saying is so and true and right doctrinally. They may be in the right doctrinally. We got it right here. But they want to be careful in how they bring that to that individual, because that person needs to be shepherded spiritually as well. So it can be disheartening, and it has to be handled very carefully in many situations, especially. Zane?
Well, I just asked Don, why do they think that? Well, I don't understand.
I don't know that either. I still don't understand it.
You know,
Family's family, and the church is to supplement whatever the family can do. Well, that was just the opposite in several cases.
just to be honest with you, Zane, now listen, y'all please understand how I mean this. I'm not assigning a certain type of heart to everybody where there could be legitimate misunderstanding. So please don't misunderstand me. But you asked a question that I think I have at least a possible, unfortunately, I will not say probable, a possible, in some situations, answer. That sure would be easier on me.
But even, I mean, I get that, it's like.
I think sometimes that would be easier on me.
Continue living their life, they don't want to spend their time and their money, but even the world takes care of their family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
most of them anyway.
Yeah.
So when we're from the world, that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's easy to say we put our contribution in what we use and justify some return on what you've done to the congregation with your finances. What are they gonna do for me if I need it?
Have you ever felt like this? I know you have. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to say, as the old saying goes, if I were a betting man, I'd just about bet the house that you have. I know I have. What have I paid all these premiums for over the years? I've paid Allstate for 30 years, or I've paid them 30 years and hadn't had a single claim. And now we've got this one small claim, and then, we're going to jack your rates up because we had to pay a claim. We're going to jack your rates way up, that kind of thing. You're thinking, what's all this money that I've paid you over these 30 years or whatever? You ever felt that way? But that's an analogy to, I think, not what what Brother Gaddis is saying. What about what I've done? This is serious business here. There is that honor which we want to give, should want to give, need to give, that may be in many ways viewed by a lot of folks as deserving, but he does have some qualifiers, and this is doctrine. By the way, back to that. This is doctrine also. So, as you look in verse 4 and verse 5 and verse 6, and then he wraps up this first bit of thinking in a greater section that we still have to go through. But this first bit of thinking, and these things command. So, command's hard to misunderstand. It should be hard to misunderstand. But if anyone does not provide, now we're in verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Okay. That's a strong verse. That's a strong verse, right? I sometimes say this. I may say it too much. I think there are some passages of Scripture or some wording in Scripture that you've almost got to want to misunderstand to do so. You know, this may be leaning that direction, verse 8. And think about elders, to use Don's example earlier. And then Zane's question, why do they do that? Think about sitting around a table with elders in a congregation, and they get up to this particular point, and an elder just